Hellos and welcome to another video. So in this video I'm basically going to be comparing Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen a little bit more. Now this isn't going to be my full review of Lords of the Fallen because I haven't played enough of it to really feel like I can give a proper final opinion of the game, my final verdict of it yet. But I'm planning on having that video out maybe Saturday or Sunday, my final opinion on Lords of the Fallen, my final review, like I did for Lies of P and like I did for Armored Core 6 before it, where, you know, about a week or two after the game's release, I do a proper sit-down, half an hour-ish video talking about my final opinions on the game. This video is going to be a bit more of sort of like a overview of Soulslikes and how I like some aspects of how Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen have both approached the Souls-like genre and what they've done with the formula. Now, just beforehand, before getting into it, mainly Lies of P, in my personal opinion, is probably one of my favourite video games of all time. Now, I think, now I've played through it a couple of times, I really love the game. And it would definitely be, I'm not sure about top 10, but definitely in my top 20 video games of all time. Lords of the Fallen, it's growing on me, okay? I think the launch really did leave a sour taste in my mouth. With how terrible the game ran at launch. It has since ironed itself out a little bit with a few patches, and I do think it's definitely in a much better place. It's still not fantastic. There are still some performance issues, and I still do have some big issues with certain aspects of the game, but I'll get more into those when I do my final video, my final review of the game. But what I find interesting really is how they both developers, Hexworks, as well as Neowiz, both approached making a Souls-like and what they borrowed from the Souls games and what they didn't. Now, obviously, Lies of P mostly has taken things from Bloodborne as well as Sekiro, whereas Lords of the Fallen has mostly borrowed things from the Dark Souls trilogy and Elden Ring. Now, one thing that I really liked was Lies of P, how it merged essentially the combat system of the Dark Souls games, Bloodborne and Sekiro, into one smooth combat experience, which is one of the main things that I think was incredibly impressive about that game, was that they basically took the parry mechanic from Sekiro, the regain system for Bloodborne, and then just the other regular stamina management system that we saw in Dark Souls games, and combined them all to make this beautiful combat system that I think is one of my favourite combat systems in all of gaming. My personal opinion, I absolutely love how the combat played in that game, and that's definitely one of Lies of P's strong suits. Now, Lords of the Fallen, on the other hand, didn't really do as much to enhance the combat experience. However, it did sort of, I feel like it did. The combat is still very good. I don't think, in my personal opinion, the combat system is one of the main things they were focusing on with Lords of the Fallen, and I do think that's probably to the game's detriment. I feel like the combat is something that they definitely could have polished a little bit more, in my opinion, because parrying, for example, in Lords of the Fallen is really not a very viable way of playing the game, and I only started doing better in Lords of the Fallen when I stopped parrying, because I was trying to parry, because obviously Lies of P was the game I'd played right before Lords of the Fallen, so going into Lords of the Fallen, hearing that it did have a parry mechanic, I was trying to utilise that. And you can also regain your health in Lords of the Fallen, similar to how you can in Lies of P. So I was thinking, okay, maybe they've got a similar thing going on here. However, parrying just is really not that viable in Lords of the Fallen, because there were several times when I got a parry dead on, absolutely perfect, and it still took damage away from me, just like a regular block. And parrying, I don't think, is something that they've really refined in Lords of the Fallen, and so I really don't think that's a way in which you can play that game. Now, exploration is the next thing that I feel like I should touch on, because Lies of P doesn't really have much in the way of exploration, whereas Lords of the Fallen does. So Lies of P definitely was trying to tell a more of a streamlined narrative through its gameplay experience. It definitely was not on the nose. There was never a time in the game where I felt like the story was being shoved down your throat. but it still was more story focused, you could say. Generally in Lies of P, you go from point A to B to C to D and progress through the game in a very linear fashion, which I do think is one of the game's negative things. Lords of the Fallen, on the other hand, generally once you get into the main game, you do have a choice of where to go. Now, it takes a bit of a while to get there, but when you do properly get into the main Lords of the Fallen experience, you do have a lot more freedom into where you want to go and what path you want to go down and what areas you want to approach in what order. And I do like that about the game. It has a bit more of a sense of exploration, especially with the Umbral system where you can go into this other world. It does mean like it feels you can explore a bit more. The game's a little bit more non-linear in that aspect in terms of the order in which you can progress through the areas, which is one thing Lies of P did not really do. And it's something I think Lords of the Fallen did do really well, as well as also, obviously, the story in Lords of the Fallen, it does still feel like it's a bit more there than in Dark Souls, and it's a bit more cheesy than in Dark Souls as well, which I really don't like. I really hate how cheesy the fantasy story is in Lords of the Fallen. I think it's definitely one of its weakest aspects, and in my opinion, I think they should have gone for having a bit more, like the voice acting as well is pretty poor. But anyway, to be fair, the voice acting is not great in Lies of P either. But anyway, and next I think I want to go into the bosses. Now, how they approached bosses in both games is actually interesting because there's a lot of parallels between Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen in many ways, to be fair, in terms of like the Spectre system as well, where it's called a Spectre in Lies of P, or just the summons in Lords of the Fallen, where you can summon in NPCs as many times as you want. Generally in Lies of P you do have to spend star fragments, but there's in such abundance that generally it feels unlimited. So, and the Spectres both appear right into the boss fight with you, and that's also interesting. It's very similar in a lot of ways, like I said, and the bosses mainly is in both Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen, you have essentially your main bosses, which are the big, massive bosses which have loads of health, they're really tanky, they hit really hard, and then you also have what are basically mini-bosses, which are more humanoid opponents, but they still have a boss health bar, boss music, and they're still given the boss treatment, which is quite interesting that both games opted to do this, which I find quite interesting because Dark Souls doesn't really do that. Generally in Dark Souls and Elden Ring, all bosses are pretty tough, they're pretty strong. Elden Ring, the dungeon bosses are a little bit weaker, and you do have the field bosses which you encounter out in the open world, which are also a little bit weaker, but generally there aren't any, like, you know, smaller bosses, like mini bosses, which are sort of, well, you do have mini bosses Elden Ring, but you know what I mean. Then, like, it's in Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen, there's a very clear distinction between what is a main, big, massive creature boss and a humanoid boss, which is, you know, is going to be much easier when you walk into that far gate, and it's a humanoid opponent, generally with a weapon set, and pretty easy to dodge attacks, and they're much easier to have lower health. Both games opted to have that, which I find quite interesting. It's an interesting parallel between the two games, and I wonder why they did that, because maybe it was a way of them fleshing out the boss count in both games. So Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen, if you're just talking about the main creature monster fights, only probably have about 15 bosses each. That's just an estimate. I mean, it could be more or less. And then you've also got probably 15 humanoid opponents, humanoid enemies, generally as bosses, which are sort of like your lower bosses. They're not as hard, then, you know, they're much easier, and they have much more predictable weapons, and generally you can get their outfits and you can get their weapons generally. So it's an interesting parallel between, and I wonder why they both opted to do that. Probably, like I said, to flesh out the boss count and maybe make a few of them a bit, you know, take less work to do. But anyway, Lords of the Fallen and Lies of P, in my personal opinion, are definitely the best Souls-likes we've got yet. Even though I have issues with Lords of the Fallen, and I think there are definitely some performance issues, and I really don't like how the company generally disguise the performance issues by only allowing the reviewers to review PC copies of the game, and they couldn't really get a PlayStation 5 or Xbox review. You know, they didn't allow them until after the game already launched, and then they only announced that the console versions had issues after the game released. I really don't like that. I think it's really shady. And like, for example, like Lords of the Fallen, I met all of the criteria. I haven't spoken about this before, so I met all of the criteria to get an early access version of Lords of the Fallen. Right? I applied for it on their website, on this little page where you can get, if you're a creator, you can go onto this page and you can apply for an early version of the game. I applied for an early version of the game and I was approved an early version of the game. They said that I could have an early version of the game. I said yes. But then I put down that I wanted an Xbox version of the game and they didn't send me a copy. I find that really shady, personally, myself, and I think it's really dodgy, and I don't like that. It is a massive thing that's really left a sour taste in my mouth about this game, Lords of the Fallen. But I'm trying to put that aside, and I will put it aside in my final review on Saturday or Sunday as well, and I will not focus on that too much. But it's definitely something that's affected my experience with it, but it's definitely still a very good game. I'll say that now. It's patched up a bit. It plays better. Both Lies of P and Lords of the Fallen are definitely both the best Souls-likes that we've got. They're very close to the actual Dark Souls experience. I just have a bit of a bias towards Lies of P, but we'll talk about that more on Saturday and Sunday, whenever the video comes out. If you enjoyed this video, also, I'm a little bit under the weather currently, so if I sound a bit off or whatever, then apologies. I'm a little bit under the weather currently. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Maybe share this video if you thought my video was good enough. Thank you again for watching. This is Chaos Soul signing out. Have a good one.